Welcome back to Cityscape Brewing. Today, we're transferring the beer that we just made in our How to Brew video to a secondary. If you haven't seen our How to Brew, the step-by-step instructions for all grain brewing, I'm going to link that in the video description below for you. Today, we're finishing up our Oberon American Wheat Ale. We're going to be transferring that to a secondary now that fermentation has completed. As you notice, and you might notice this in your own batch, when it was brewing, it had a nice foamy cap on here. And since the brewing has finalized, you may have noticed that that cap has actually fallen down and back into the beer. You might have some slight residue and stuff on the top, that's normal. And then a lot of the stuff at the bottom has just condensed into like a tube on the bottom of the fermenter. And so that's super normal as well. And so primary fermentation is done, and we're going to be going into what we call secondary fermentation, or conditioning your beer before packaging, whether that be bottles or kegs after the fact. So today we're going to be transferring this one into a secondary. One thing to mention is that secondary fermenting is optional. A lot of people leave it in this primary vessel for the remainder of the conditioning period, and you can either cold crash that and then package, or just go straight to a bottling bucket and bottle your beers, or go right into a keg after that. I choose for most of my beers to go into a secondary. It helps for clear beer, I feel like, and as long as you're not really oxidizing your beer and splashing it around too much, I think it really helps. But you may find that that's something you don't want to do, and that's totally normal. The only time I don't go into a secondary a lot of times is for hazy beers where oxidation is particularly important for that style of beer. In this particular case, since it's just an American Wheat Ale, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how to transfer it to a secondary. That helps clean up the beer. I'll leave that in there for a week. And during this time, this is when you would normally go into something like dry hopping, or if you're doing like a sour with some fruit in it, you would put your fruit in it this period. And so secondaries can be beneficial for a variety of reasons. But we'll get right into it. Before you get to this stage where you pull out your vessel, you don't want to shake it around a whole lot. You don't want to disturb the settlement that's already happened in the beer a lot. So you want to be very careful. Bring this in, set it in a high place, because we're going to be using our racking cane and auto siphon to be able to get it into the secondary vessel. So before we get to this stage, make sure that you have your auto siphon and hose cleaned and sanitized, and then your secondary vessel. In this case, I'm going to be using a glass carboy, 6.5 gallon glass carboy and lid. You'll also need a bung and an airlock. And this, I'm using the S style, and this and with a bung in the top. You can also use another bucket, or if in this case you have a smaller mouth glass carboy, you'd use a bung like this one has on the top, and one of the two airlocks in the top. In this case, you're not going to see a lot of fermentation action in the secondary, so an airlock like this style or the can style is sufficient. So I'm going to go ahead and get right into it. When we're transferring this, we're also going to take a gravity reading. So you're going to want to make sure you have your hydrometer ready, and then your cylinder to put the hydrometer in. And this is important because in the Learn to Brew video, we used a refractometer. In this case, we're going to use a hydrometer because the refractometer will need a calculation, because now the wort has turned into beer. Now that primary fermentation is done, there's alcohol content in here, and it throws off the reading of your refractometer. So your hydrometer reading is what you're going to want to do at this stage. So with that, I'll show you how to get that done. Let's get it set up to transfer to the next vessel. All right, so we got our racking cane. It's all sanitized. We're going to go ahead and put the outlet into the new vessel that's already cleaned and sanitized, into our secondary fermentation vessel. In this case, I have a little clip thing here, and I'm going to use that once we get this into the primary fermenter. But an auto siphon, what you're going to do is you're going to stick that into the primary, and you're going to pump it until the gravity takes hold inside of this tube, and it's going to go on down to the secondary vessel. What you don't want is there to be a lot of room between the bottom of this secondary vessel and the tube, because you don't want a lot of oxidation to get inside of this vessel. Sometimes I even pump a little bit of CO2 inside of this, but that's not a big deal as long as you're not creating a lot of air bubbles and that kind of stuff. So you don't want to drop in there. You want to be as smooth as possible with as little bit of introduction of oxygen as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stick this into my primary. And then I'm going to pump it a couple times once I get it about halfway down. I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to pump it a couple times. And that's going to bring the beer down this hose, and gravity is going to do the work from here on out. So then the hose is on the bottom of the fermentation vessel, and it is just circulating in there, but I don't want it to be splashing around a lot. And so what it's doing right now is it's just filling up from the primary into the secondary vessel. And right away what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my cylinder that I have for my hydrometer reading, and I'm going to fill this up as carefully as I can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach down, grab this hose, I'm going to fill this up. I want it to be about 3/4 of the way full so I have enough to do my hydrometer reading, but without splashing a lot and introducing oxygen into the secondary fermenter. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that, and I'm going to bring it up the side of the fermentation chamber a little bit. So even if it does splash a little bit, it is on the side of the chamber. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this up. I'm going to quickly get it back down to the bottom so introduce as little oxygen as possible. But here we go. We have a cylinder full of our new beer. I'm going to set that off to the side, and we're going to do a hydrometer reading. So this is now coming down. Our auto siphon is kind of set against the side of it, and as we get closer to the bottom here, I'm going to have to lower that down. What I don't want to do is disturb this tube that's on the bottom. So I'll take off the harness a little bit so you can see that. But there is a layer of yeast and trub on the bottom of this vessel, and you probably see it better without the harness there, but it's a white cake basically. It's about this big around, and you could reuse this because a lot of that is yeast into another beer. So if you're making something where this was a very unique strain, like we just harvested the yeast, which I'll put that video down in the video description, you could reuse this Bell's yeast, which is Imperial A62, into another beer. So what you'd want to do is get as much beer off of this, and then you could pour that into a mason jar and reuse that yeast, and just by pouring the whole trub into the next beer. I'm going to do a video on that again so everybody can see what that's like. But in this case, we're not going to be saving it. So I'm just going to get as much of the beer out as possible, and then we're just going to discard the rest of it. But reusing yeast is something that breweries do all the time, and a lot of times they do exactly that. They save this bottom trub, they decant off some of the beer, and then they just dump the whole thing into the next batch. So they don't wash it, they don't rinse the yeast, anything like that. They'll just dump it in. So that's very common for especially smaller craft breweries to do that. So as we get going down, I'm going to move this racking cane down just a little bit into the beer. Again, even if it sets on the bottom, it's got a little bit of a nozzle at the end, so it won't get into the trub too much. But we want to just very gently set it on top of it, and it's still going to be pulling the beer from on top instead of sucking from the bottom. I'm going to let this transfer down, and as we get to the end here, I'll zoom in and show you kind of how I tilt the container a little bit to get every last bit. All right, we're getting down to the last couple of inches of the beer, and you can tell that the racking cane is still down there. It's still kind of touching that bottom layer of sediment at the bottom. What I'm going to do as it gets a little bit closer to where that would stop eventually, I'm going to tilt this just a little bit sideways so that the remaining little bit of beer can be sucked out. But again, we're not trying to suck off the sediment that's both on the top or that is on the bottom of this. So we're just going to gently tilt this. What I like to do is just put one hand underneath one side of it like this to tilt it gently, and that brings more volume to the side where my racking cane, which is hard to see on the video, but it's kind of going diagonally down to this corner. And so I'm just going to put my hand gently down there to give it a little bit of angle. And then as the beer kind of empties out of the vessel here, I'm gonna raise my hand underneath this just a little bit till we get the last little bit of beer out of there. And again, we're not gonna try to get every last drop because that's gonna start sucking in some of that sediment and some of the trub on the bottom. But this does help you get another about glass full or bottle full of beer out of it. And in the secondary, you'll also have some sediment on the bottom of your secondary vessel. So if you suck up a little bit of the trub or a little bit of the top layer, that's no big deal. You'll be able to clean that out with our secondary vessel. So, all right, we're getting back down. It's probably about halfway of the volume. And I'm gonna go ahead and just pull this up. And that is going to stop the suction from our racking cane. And I'm gonna set it back down in here and I'm gonna pull this out gently so again it doesn't introduce a bunch of air. And just put this thing right in there. And then we'll just have to clean this with our PBW or OxyClean. In my case, I use that. And what we have left is our clear beer without the trub and without the sediment in this vessel. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put on our lid. All right, we're going to go ahead and put our lid on top of our secondary, and then go ahead and put our airlock on here. In this case, it's a bung with the S-shaped airlock, and go ahead and fit that in there snugly. For this particular vessel, I have a harness on the top, and this harness also has like a lid protector. Not protector, I guess. It just kind of keeps it from, if there's an active fermentation, it helps it from, so it doesn't push the lid off. So it has a lid holder on it for the big mouth bubbler. I'm gonna go ahead and lock that up. Okay, so this is done. And we're gonna go ahead and next put this back into my fermentation chamber, which is behind us. It's an old cooler that I've converted and has a temperature controller on it. You saw that in my brew day video. I'm gonna go ahead and put this in here, and this is gonna be about a week. And then we will show you how to take that hydrometer reading. And a lot of times I would do that ahead of time to see where I'm at before I transfer this into the secondary. But I noticed that this was been completed for a couple of days now, and it was ready to move into the secondary regardless. But we'll take and show you how to do that hydrometer reading next. All right, so we got our cylinder sample full of beer that we just transferred to our secondary. And this is gonna be how to take a hydrometer reading. In this case, we're gonna be using our cylinder that we filled up with beer and just our standard hydrometer. Again, when we did our how to brew day, we used a refractometer. And since this has alcohol present, the hydrometer is gonna be better. There is a calculator you can do online if you have a refractometer and do it that way. But this is obviously more accurate to use the hydrometer. So we're gonna go ahead, we're just gonna give this a little spin as we dunk it into the beer. And then we're gonna get a reading on the hydrometer about where our final gravity is. And final gravity meaning we're done with fermentation. It is going into a secondary, and it isn't uncommon to have it drop a point during secondary fermentation, but that's unlikely. Depends how much yeast that you have really got suspended in your beer and if it starts fermenting again. If you had fruit or something like that in a secondary, it isn't uncommon to start fermenting, rapidly even again, depending on how much sugar is present. But most of the yeast would have been in that trub on the bottom, and we shouldn't have to worry about that. So right now, I'm getting a hydrometer reading. We're just gonna give that another spin of about 1.0, either 10 or 09, so 1009 or 1010. That's a little bit below what our target was. I'm just gonna go ahead and give this a quick spin and dunk again to get the air bubbles off and make sure it's not floating anywhere. Our sheet that we have from Bell's Brewery said that our final gravity target should be about 1012 or 1.012 final gravity target. We're actually a little bit below that, so we're going to be having a little bit higher ABV on this one. So it really took off in fermentation, And so we were a little bit higher to be expected in our starting gravity. Yeah, it's definitely below 1.010. So it's actually more like 1009, so 1.009 at this reading. And so we'll go ahead and mark that on our brew day sheet for the racking into the secondary. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that now. Today is the 18th. And we're going to put 1.009. And that should actually help us get to the ABV, and that can be done using a calculator online. There's a lot of different calculators. You can do the ABV calculator on Google and you'll come up with a whole bunch of them. But you'll put in your starting gravity, which in our case was 1.059, and then you'll put your final gravity, and that is 1.009, and it should come out with the correct ABV for this beer. So I'll post what that looks like on the video here so you can tell what our ABV ended up being for this beer. And then we will do another video showing you how to rack into the serving chamber, which in this case will be a keg, or into a bottling bucket, so you can go ahead and do your bottling process. And that'll be the next video. So racking from secondary into your serving vessel or bottling bucket. One thing I always do at this level is go ahead and just give it a little sample. And if it's good after the primary, it's even going to be better after the secondary and conditioning period. Right now it's warm, it's uncarbonated, but if it's got a good flavor, it's pretty much going to be a good beer when it gets done. So you'll be able to tell if there's any really off flavors in this as well. So we're going to go ahead and give it a sip. Yeah, I think that's going to be a solid beer. So with that, we'll be back with the next video on racking to the either keg or bottling bucket to finish up the racking and going from secondary to the final vessel. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. That helps you see future videos that we do on teaching you how to brew better beer. So with that, thanks, and we'll see you next time.